I was 3 days out of my first spore bloom when the scanner lit. That is how I have always started when I tell this. Not with the contact, not with the silence that followed, but with the fact of my own newness. 3 days out of bloom. My tendrils still pale at the root, the bivolume in my drift sac barely set to full brightness. I had not yet learned to parse the difference between a true contact ping and a refraction, ghost off a cold debris field. I had not yet earned the scar memory that older communion navigators carry printed in their outer membrane. The deep, written dread of open space, the chemical knowledge that the void contains things which have no filing in any archive the Veth-Shoal Communion has ever grown. I know now that the archive gap was the whole point. I did not know it then. Troll tendril I rode was the Grevanth, a mid-weight scout hull, grown from the Communion's second breeding ground in the Ocean Passage. She was a living ship, as all our ships are, her interior walls soft and warm to the touch, pulsing faintly with circulatory fluid, navigation nodes clustered at the forward brow like a knot of sensory cilia. The Communion does not build ships. We grow them, we feed them, we mourn them when they die, because they do not simply break apart, they go quiet. The warmth leaves their walls. They go cold the way a kindred node goes cold, and you feel it through the floor plates before anyone says a word. There were 26 of us aboard the Anth, the most recently bloomed. My designation at the time was Sethsorn, Drift Navigator 4th rank, which is to say, I was a set of fresh eyes with a scanner lobe that had not yet been asked to do anything difficult. Troll corridor we were assigned ran along the outer margin of what the Communion calls the Thresh Veil, a band of cold space approximately 11 light weeks wide where the debris density is high enough to scatter most emission signals, making it useful for quiet movement but treacherous for contact work. The Thresh Veil is why we were there. Communion doctrine holds that an enemy moving in force will avoid high scatter corridors. A solitary contact in the Thresh Veil is almost always a refraction ghost, a cold rock drifting with a metallic signature, piece of dead hull from one of the 17 wars that have been fought along this margin over the past 200 years. Almost always. My scanner lobe registered the contact at the 4th hour of the 3rd patrol cycle. I was at my station, doing what newly bloomed navigators do on long patrols, watching the readout hum, fighting the pull of rest state, trying to remember every point of doctrine I had been grown with. The contact came in the way contacts come in the Thresh Veil, not as a sharp, clean signature but as a smear, a suggestion, a line of slightly wrong readings that my lobe flagged because the scatter pattern didn't match the background debris correctly. The debris in this sector drifts on predictable vectors. The thing I had found was not drifting. It was not moving the way a rock moves. It was moving the way a hull moves, when the engines are suppressed to their lowest possible output, and is trying very hard not to exist. I ran the check twice, the way they teach you. Both readings matched. I ran the 3rd stage rejection protocol, the standard filter that strips refraction ghosts and thermal bounce, and the contact survived it. It survived all 3 filters, which means it was real. I reported it to Drift Senior Veth-Keln, who commanded the Grevanth's navigation cell. Veth-Keln was old in the Communion way, her outer membrane printed with 60 years of open space service, the bivolume in her drift sac deep amber from age and exposure. She had 7 scar memories visible through her outer membrane. I counted them, as I had told them that the number of scar memories a navigator carries is a rough measure of how many things in the void have tried to kill them. She looked at my readout for a long time. Then she looked at me. Then she looked at the readout again. Suppressed output, she said. It was not a quest, Drift Senior. No emission tail. None. No drive wash. No heat signature past the contact point itself. No residual. It is moving cold. Veth-Keln pulled the readout to her own scanner lobe and ran her own 3-stage rejection. The contact survived her filters too. She ran a 4th protocol I had seen before, a deep phase comparison that layers the contact against the Communion's entire debris archive for this sector, cross-checking against every known wreck, every catalogued drift object, every hull fragment logged in the last 200 years. This took 9 minutes. I watched her face during those 9 minutes. I learned more about the nature of the void from watching her face during those 9 minutes than I had learned in the entirety of my Bloom education. When the fourth protocol completed, she looked at the readout once more. Then she went to the command node and woke Shoal Commander Drethavar. Drethavar was the senior officer aboard the Grev. Anth. He had 40 years of patrol experience and a reputation in our breeding ground for being constitutionally unimpressed by things that impressed other commanders. He came to the navigation cell still half in rest state, the bivolume in his drift sack cycling through its wake-up brightening, and he looked at the readout the way all senior officers look at readouts from newly bloomed navigators, with a patience that was so deliberate it was almost unkind. Then the patience drained out of his face entirely. He stared at the contact for what felt like a long time. He ran no additional protocols. He did not need to. What he was looking at was not ambiguous to a man with 40 years of service. It was the most unusual reading he had ever seen. And he had seen things that would have ended my Bloom education permanently if I had encountered them at the start, rather than the end of my first. Troll. No archive entry, he said. No, Shoal Commander. Cross-referenced against every hull pattern in the Communion's known space catalog. The fourth protocol uses the full catalog, Shoal Commander. It found nothing. He was quiet for a moment, then, size estimate. I had run the size estimate. It had come back wrong. I had run it again because I assumed I had made an error. It had come back wrong again. I showed him the figure. He was quiet for a longer moment. The size estimate was not possible. Not because the number itself was extraordinary. The Communion has seen hulls of comparable mass. We have grown them. What made the number impossible was the combination of that mass with the emission profile I had recorded. Nothing that large moved that cold. The suppression ratio. The relationship between the hull's mass and the heat signature it was producing was outside any parameter in our records. It was not marginally outside. It was not a fringe case. It was wrong in the way that a fundamental physical assumption is wrong when you discover it, has been violated without your permission. Wake the rest of the cell, Drethavar said, and begin full passive monitoring. Nothing active, nothing that touches it. We do not ping it, we do not query it, we watch. Shoal Commander. The contact is moving on a vector that will bring it within 800 Communion measures of our position in approximately. I know, he said. We watched. I want to explain what the next 4 hours were, because I do not think the Communion's official record of this engagement captures it correctly, and I do not think anyone who was not aboard the Grev. Those 4 hours and what I mean when I say that the watching was itself a kind of education, not the kind that comes from doctrine or from Bloom training, the kind that comes from sitting in the dark with all active emissions suppressed, breathing quietly, while something you cannot classify moves through the Thresh Veil on a course that will bring it 800 Communion measures, and understanding gradually, not all at once, but gradually the way cold seeps into a hull, that the thing moving toward you does not know you are there, and that this is the only reason you are still breathing. Avar ordered full emission suppression the moment he confirmed the contact's vector. The Grevanth went dark. Every active transmitter closed. Every drive system throttled to the minimum output required to hold our position relative to the debris field, the navigation nodes cycling down to passive only. The hull did not like it. Living ships do not like being asked to breathe quietly. The circulatory system fights the suppression. The bivolume in the walls dims and flickers as the biological systems search for an equilibrium. We're not grown to maintain. We sat in that dimmed, warm, slightly restless dark for 4 hours, and we watched. The 26 crew of the Grev are worth naming, because no one in the official record has named them, and I think they deserve the record. I will not list all 26 here. That is a different document, and I have written it. But I want to describe what those 26 beings did during those 4 hours, because it was the most disciplined thing I have ever witnessed aboard a living ship. They held still. 26 crew members aboard a hull that was biologically uncomfortable, in a corridor they could not see clearly, Watching a contact they could not classify approach to within 800 communion measures, and they held still and breathed quietly and did their work. Veth-Shoal ran her passive sweep cycles on a precise 8-minute interval and logged every return without deviation. The engine cell navigator maintained the suppression output within margin ponds so tight they would have been notable in a training evaluation. The hull itself, responding to the crew's collective stillness, gradually settled. The bivolume steadied, circulatory pulse slowed to something approaching normal, and the graven became, over those 4 hours, as close to absent from the space she occupied as a living ship can manage. I thought, watching this happen, that we were performing a small and imperfect imitation of the thing we were watching. We were trying to be invisible. We were not succeeding in the way the contact was succeeding. Our suppression was biological and imprecise, a trained behavior rather than a manufactured one. But we were trying, and the effort itself taught me something about the contact that I could not have learned from the readout alone. To move cold through a high scatter corridor for the duration we had tracked, this contact required not just the surface treatment and the drive suppression architecture. It required the people inside the hull to hold still too, to breathe quietly, to suppress every active emission, not just technically, but operationally, to run a ship at combat capability while producing nothing that the void around it could register as evidence of existence. 26 crew members on a scout tendril could barely manage it for 4 hours. Whatever crew was aboard, that hull had been managing it for a duration I could not estimate. Across a distance I could only bracket from the ship's last known communion contact point, which was not logged. Because the ship had never been logged, the contact did not deviate. It did not accelerate. It did not alter its emission profile by any detectable margin over 4 hours of continuous passive monitoring. It moved with the steady, unhurried purposefulness of something that has a destination and no particular interest in anything that lies between it and that destination. I built a picture of it, slowly, through passive accumulation, hull geometry, inferred from the scatter pattern and the gravitational microsignature, configuration, wedge primary with secondary hull masses that resolved themselves after 3 hours into what appeared to be weapon platform arrays, though I could not confirm that because nothing aboard was active. Plating not organic, not grown, manufactured, metal alloy with a surface treatment that absorbed rather than reflected. The whole outer surface of the hull had been engineered to make it difficult to find, not merely quiet, actively designed to be absent from the space it occupied. That was the detail that Veth-Shoal noticed before I did. She whispered to me without taking her eyes off the readout. The surface treatment, she said. Do you see it? The absorption profile? Yes. That does not happen by accident, Seth Sorn. That is a choice. Someone chose to make that hull difficult to find, and then they built the choice into the hull's outer layer at the manufacturing stage. I sat with that for a moment. That means it was designed from the beginning to move through space without being detected. Yes. And it has no archive entry. The Communion has never seen it before. That we know of, she said. Those are different things. I did not understand the difference then. I understand it now. At the end of the 4th hour, Drethavar made a command decision that I have thought about almost every day since. He opened a tight beam channel to the nearest Communion coordination node, a cluster of linked ships, 3 light hours distant, that served as the Veth-Shoal anchor, and he transmitted 2 things. First, the full passive monitoring record. Second, a request for classification guidance and a recommendation that the nearest available shoal cluster be moved toward the contact's projected vector. The coordination node acknowledged the transmission. The shoal commander and 3 shoal clusters were redirected within the following 6 hours. In terms of Communion doctrine, this was exactly the correct response. An unclassified contact of unknown origin, unknown capability, and mass parameters outside normal range, moving cold through a high scatter corridor on a vector that led toward Communion-held space. This was precisely the situation for which shoal cluster redirection existed. You do not send a lone scout tendril against something unclassified. You send a shoal cluster. You send enough living mass to be confident of the outcome, regardless of what the unclassified thing turns out to be. These shoal cruisers meant 900 hulls. 900 hulls. That number will stay with me for the rest of my life. I did not know, in the moment Drethavar made his request, what that number would mean in 32 hours. I did not know that I would still be alive at the end of those 32 hours because of a single decision Drethavar made that the doctrine manuals do not cover, because no doctrine manual in the Communion's history had needed to cover it. Let me tell you what 32 hours took when you are watching 900 of your kinhulls move towards something that should not exist. The 3 shoal cruisers arrived in the Thresh Vale corridor on staggered approach vectors, as doctrine requires broad dispersal to deny the contact any single engagement axis, with the scout tendril Grevanth held at the rear margin as a monitoring platform. From our position, I had continuous passive line of sight to the engagement sector. I watched the shoal cruisers deploy. I watched the living hulls spread into their approach formations, their bioluminescent running patterns cycling through the deep red of combat readiness, their weapon cysts warming, their drift nets extending for targeting data. The contact, which by this point I had been staring at for the better part of a full day, and had begun to think of as a fixed point in my understanding of the universe, did not react to the shoal cruiser's arrival. It continued on its vector. It did not deviate. It did not alter its emission profile. It did not respond to the presence of 900 living combat hulls on its approach course in any way that my monitoring equipment could detect. Shoal Commander Vrethon, commanding the lead cluster, transmitted the standard Communion hail on all frequencies. The contact did not respond. He transmitted twice more, with the standard interval. Then, per doctrine, he issued the engagement authorization. I watched the first shoal cluster close. What happened over the next 40 minutes? I have gone over in my own memory so many times that the sequence has the quality of a fixed text, something written down, precise, with no room for interpretation, even though what I was watching was chaos. First shoal cluster deployed its drift nets at 800 Communion measures. The drift nets are the Communion's primary engagement tool at medium range, vast organic meshes of chemically reactive filament that foul an enemy's, drive systems on contact, and allow the living hull to then close for ingestion. Against anything we had ever fought, the drift nets worked. They are slow to deploy, but nearly impossible to avoid once they are open. Nothing that moves without precognition can navigate a 3-cluster drift net deployment in an active engagement. The contact moved through the drift nets, not around them, not over them, through them. The hull struck the leading edge of the first net at a velocity I had to run twice to confirm, because the figure I got back suggested the contact had accelerated from its patrol-silent state to drive full to output in less time than my monitoring equipment could register the transition. One moment it was cold and quiet. Next moment it was moving, at a speed that made the drift nets irrelevant, that made the entire 3-cluster dispersal formation irrelevant, because the contact was not engaging the Communion hulls in the way Communion doctrine predicted an enemy would engage them. It was not trying to destroy us from a distance. It was not firing long-range engagement weapons or standing off to use superior reach. It was moving into the shoal cruisers, directly into them, into the densest concentration of 900 living hulls, into the space where our interlocking defense secretions were thickest, into the space where any sane enemy with a survivable hull would never voluntarily go. What I understand now, and did not understand then, is that the hull was not doing this because its crew had made a tactical decision to engage at close range. The hull was doing this because it had been designed to do this, because the entire architecture of the vessel, from the surface treatment to the weapon placement to the drive characteristics that allowed the transition from cold run to full output in under a detectable interval, had been built around the assumption that it would be inside an enemy formation at some point, and that being inside an enemy formation was not a crisis to be survived, but a condition to be exploited. The hull had been built. I corrected myself, they build, for exactly this, for the inside of the swarm, place where every living hull in our doctrine expected an enemy to be weakest, because no enemy had ever wanted to be there. I heard Vorthkeln breathe a single sound, Not a word, not a communion concept phrase, just a sound, low and involuntary, the kind of sound a navigator makes when something in the readout violates a rule they thought was a law. The first shoal cluster tried to close around the contact. This is the correct counter move. When an enemy attempts to penetrate formation center, you fold the flanks in. You surround the intruder. You use your mass advantage and your living hull ingestion capability to overwhelm whatever has come inside your envelope. 900 hulls is not a collection of individual vessels that have to coordinate through signal lag. A shoal cluster breathes together. It contracts like a muscle. 3 clusters doing this in unison represents a force that the Communion has used to end wars. The contact did not slow. I watched the weapon platform arrays on the contact's hull become active. They had been still for the entire day and a half I had been watching. Now they moved. I could see the power signature blooming in my passive monitoring readout. A sudden hard edge where everything had been soft. And then the weapons, which I will try to describe in a way that is accurate. They were projectile-based. I know this because the drive signature of the munitions was distinct from directed energy discharge, and the impact patterns I was tracking on the leading Communion hulls showed kinetic penetration rather than thermal wash. The contact fired continuously, not in bursts, not in intervals. It fired as it moved, in a sustained output that my monitoring equipment's acoustic analog sensor could capture as a kind of constant low vibration, a register so deep it was almost not sound. The mechanical voice of something that had built itself specifically to produce that output and had no other purpose. The first Communion hull that went quiet did so 3 minutes after the contact entered the formation envelope. I watched the bioluminescent running signal go out. Not damage flicker, the irregular cycling a hull shows when it is hurt and trying to heal. Just out. The hull went cold the way a kindred node goes cold, and I felt it through the floor plates of the Grevanth. Despite the fact that we were 600 Communion measures from the engagement sector, then another, then 3 more in rapid succession, then too many to track individually. The thing about watching living hulls die from a distance is that the readout does not fully convey what you know it means. The bioluminescent signal is a number, a frequency value, a presence indicator in a monitoring column. When it goes out, the column shows a 0 and moves on. The readout does not mourn, but the navigator reading it knows. The navigator who was grown with the biological understanding that a living hull's signal is its life, that the warmth in its walls is a continuous act of living, that when the signal ceases the hull is not broken but dead. The navigator knows exactly what the 0 means, and carries it differently than the readout does. I watched 27 zeros appear in my monitoring column. In the first 6 minutes of the engagement, my training held. My hands were still on the scanner controls. My voice was quiet when I updated the count for Dreth-Avar. I am telling you this, not because I want credit for it, but because I think it is worth recording. The fact that training can hold a newly bloomed navigator together through something that the training was not designed to prepare them for. Vorath Keln's 8-minute sweep cycle continued. Anth's hull was still warm under my palms. I kept watching. Shoal Commander Vrethon attempted to collapse the cluster formation onto the contact's hull. This was not a mistake. Given what he knew, it was the correct decision. The contact was inside his envelope, it was moving, and his only path to survival was to bring the biological mass of the cluster itself to bear, to surround and ingest. He transmitted the contraction order on the Communion bond frequency. I have the transmission record. His voice was steady. The contact, at the moment the contraction order was transmitted, altered its vector. I want to be precise about what I mean. The contact did not slow in order to change direction. It did not arc through a turn the way any vessel of that mass must arc through a turn unless it is willing to accept structural loading that should tear its hull apart. It moved the way a thought moves. The heading simply became different. The momentum of the previous heading absorbed or redirected in a duration. My equipment bracketed at less than 4 seconds. And then it was moving at the same speed on a new vector that took it directly through the densest node of the contraction formation, through the place where the cluster's living mass was thickest, through the place where no ship the size of that contact should have been able to go. Without being overwhelmed by sheer biological pressure, it went through. Shoal Commander Veth-Shoal's hull went cold, 11 minutes after the engagement began. I know this because I was watching his hull's bioluminescent signal in a secondary display, the way a newly bloomed navigator watches the commander's hull when they are frightened and need to believe that the person in charge is still there. Watched his signal go from combat red to cold, in a time frame so short there was no intermediate state. 1 second he was there, then he was not. I did not have time to understand what I had seen. Veth-Shoal was already issuing orders. All passive monitoring, maximum range. We watch, we record. Nothing active. I turned back to my primary readout. The engagement sector was no longer a readable formation. 3 shoal cruisers had lost their dispersal geometry. Not because they had contracted as ordered, because the contact had moved through them multiple times, and the living hulls that remained active were no longer holding their assigned positions. They were clustering, which is what communion hulls do under extreme duress. They pull toward each other, seek the warmth of biological contact, try to merge definite secretions. It is an instinctive behavior, older than doctrine, built into the hull growth protocols at a level beneath conscious override. The clustering made them easier to find. The contact moved through the clustered mass with the same sustained output I had been tracking since the engagement began. It did not pause. It did not appear to be making decisions about which hull to target. It was simply moving through the space the communion occupied and engaging, hurt everything within its weapon range continuously, without apparent regard for the size or configuration of what it was engaging, without detectable preference for high-value targets over low-value ones. It was not hunting. That distinction matters to me, even now, and I have thought about why it matters. A hunter has intentions about specific prey. A hunter chooses. What I was watching did not choose. It moved through the space the communion's 900 hulls occupied, and those hulls ceased to exist as it passed through them. And the contact's behavior did not change based on what it was encountering, because it had been built for this. Not for hunting, not for strategy, not for the satisfaction of any doctrine, but simply for the persistent mechanical fact of being inside an enemy formation and continuing to function. 112. Communion hulls remained active at the 40-minute mark. 67 at the 50-minute mark. I stopped counting after that because Veth-Shoal told me to focus on the contact's current vector, which had stabilized again after the engagement, and which I needed to plot and transmit to the coordination node immediately. I pulled my attention from the dying readout of the engagement sector and forced myself to look at the numbers that told me where the contact was next. Shoal Commander, I said. My voice was doing something I had no training for, a low vibration in my vocal membrane that I recognized as the external expression of the state my entire biology was in. The contact's vector. It leads to the ocean passage. The ocean passage. Our second breeding ground. The place where the hulls of the Veth-Shoal Communion are grown. Where the seed hulls float in their growth baths. Where the new bloomed navigators take their first unassisted drift. Where the warmth of 1,000 living ships produces a faint bioluminescent glow visible to the naked eye from 50 communion measures out. The place I had come from 3 days ago. Veth-Shoal said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, "Continue monitoring and transmitting. Shoal Commander. With respect, the contact is moving toward the breeding ground. There are no combat hulls between here and..." "I know what is between here and the breeding ground," Seth Sorn. He moved to the command node. Watched him place his full transmitter array on emergency broadcast. Not the tight beam we had been using. Not the coordination node channel, the communion-wide emergency frequency. That every hull in known space has a receiver for, the one reserved for threats to the communion itself rather than to individual shoals. He transmitted a full engagement record and the contact's current vector. He transmitted it 3 times on rotating frequency keys to ensure receipt through the Veth-Shoal scatter. Then he pulled up the challenge. Grevanth's navigation display and began calculating an exit vector from the Veth-Shoal corridor. I understood what he was doing before he told me. Anth. was a scout tendril, 26 crew, a monitoring platform and a transmission relay, not a combat hull. There was nothing we could put between the contact and the ocean passage. But there was something we could do. We run, I said. We transmit and we run, he said. The Communion needs this record intact. It needs to know what this is. What is it? He looked at me for a moment. The amber bivolume of his drift sack was steady, not dimmed by fear, not cycling, just steady, the way old navigators hold steady. When the readout shows them something they have been afraid of their whole careers, and always hoped they would, never actually see. A warship, he said, a human warship. I had been grown with the concept. Every Communion navigator is grown with the concept. The human territories lie at a specific remove from Communion space. The distance is in every navigation archive. The transit time is logged and re-logged. The political status is classified as low engagement risk, meaning the Communion and the human polities coexist in a state of mutual non-interaction that neither side has found reason to disturb for more than 3 centuries. The knowledge that humans build warships is not new. The knowledge that humans have fought other species and won is not new. These are facts in the archive, the same way the mass spectrograph readings of distant stars are facts in the archive. Present, verified, and entirely abstract. What was not in the archive was this. What the archive contained I would later learn, after the engagement, after the Grevanth reached Communion-held space, after the formal review boards had gathered every piece of monitoring data I had produced and cross-referenced it against every Communion intelligence record on human military capability, was a detailed and carefully maintained record of every human warship Communion had ever catalogued, their hull configurations, their drive signatures, their weapon profiles, their registered operating ranges, their known patrol corridors, their logged construction rates and fleet composition estimates. The archive was thorough. The Communion Intelligence Division is not careless. They had files on every human hull class that had ever been observed, and those files were comprehensive, and they were updated on a rolling basis from every passive monitoring contact made by Communion scouts operating within sensor range of human space. None of those files contained a hull that matched the contact. None of them described a hull with that surface treatment. None of them included drive suppression characteristics of that quality. None of them showed a weapon platform arrangement of that configuration. The hull the Grevanth had found in the Veth-Shoal was not in any file the Communion's Intelligence Division had ever opened, cause the Communion's Intelligence Division cataloged ships by observing them, and hence this ship had been designed to prevent observation. The files on human warships were complete records of every human warship humanity had chosen to be observed in. It has no registry, I said. No emission record. No classification file. There is no Communion log of a hull of this configuration at this location, anywhere near this location, or at any location. No, Drethavar said. There is not. That means it was here before we knew it was here. Before anyone logged it. Before any patrol contacted it. Yes, I thought about the surface treatment, the absorption profile that Veth-Shoal had identified, the choice, built into the hull at the manufacturing stage, to be absent from the space it occupied, the sustained drive suppression over the entire period we had tracked it, the acceleration that produced no drive wash, no heat signature, no transition signature in my monitoring equipment. It was designed, I said, to be found only when it chose to be found. Thavar was already moving the Grevanth onto its exit vector. He did not answer immediately. Around me I could feel the hull's warmth as the drive systems came to full output. The gentle, biological shudder of the Grevanth. Beginning to run, the circulatory fluid in the walls moving faster, the way a living thing moves when it has decided to survive. Not found at all, he said, after a moment. It was designed not to be found at all. We found it because Sethsorn had fresh eyes and ran an extra filter pass. He paused. If you had been on rest cycle, if Veth-Shoal had decided it was a refraction ghost without running the 4th protocol, if I had not transmitted to the coordination node, and the clusters had not been rerouted in time to... He stopped, considered. If I had transmitted to the coordination node, and the clusters had been rerouted, and we had not recognized that the clusters were insufficient. He left that sentence open. I sat with it. The shape of what he was not saying assembled itself in my scanner lobe the way a contact assembles, itself out of background noise. Slowly, filter by filter, until the thing you have been looking for becomes the thing you cannot look away from. If the contact had moved through the Veth-Shoal without being found, if it had emerged at the ocean passage without warning, if the 900 hulls of the shoal cruisers had not been there, not because the contact could have defeated them any more easily, but because they had not been there at all. If the breeding ground, with its seed hulls and its growth baths and its newly bloomed navigators on, first unassisted drifts, had simply been in the path of a hull designed to be absent from the space it occupied until it chose not to be. "Shoal Commander," I said, "is this the only one?" He looked at me. In the amber steady light of his drift sack, I watched him decide how to answer a question that he did not, in that moment, have an answer to. "That," he said, "is what the Communion now needs to find out." We ran for 18 hours through the Veth-Shoal. Veth transmitted on every broadcast cycle. Veth held the passive monitoring array at maximum range, tracking the contact until it passed beyond our sensor horizon, which it did. Still on the same vector, still cold, its emission profile indistinguishable from the debris field it moved through. Then, it was gone from our readouts, the way a thought is gone when something loud interrupts it, and the Veth-Shoal was quiet around us, and there were no shoal clusters in it anymore. The 18 hours of running were not silent. Shade the Qs of Est, Grevanth talked, quietly, in small groupings, the low murmur of people who need to hear voices, and are disciplined enough to keep those voices from interfering with the work. I heard pieces of many conversations. I did not participate in most of them. I sat at my monitoring station and ran the passive sweep cycles the way Veth-Shoal had taught me, on the 8-minute interval, and I logged every return. And I watched the Veth-Shoal debris drift on its predictable vectors around us, with an attention that I had not been capable of 3 days earlier. The contact came up once more in my sweeps at hour 9 of the run, as a ghost edge at extreme range, barely distinguishable from the background scatter, a faint wrongness in the debris pattern, that I would not have survived the first rejection filter if I had been running the standard protocols. Ran the 4th protocol. The ghost edge survived it. Then the contact moved beyond my sensor horizon and did not return. I logged it. I said nothing to anyone until the next sweep cycle was complete. Then I told Veth. He looked at the log entry. He looked at the sensor horizon projection. He said nothing for a moment. "It was closer than we calculated," he said. "Yes, Shoal Commander. By approximately 400 communion measures. It adjusted its vector. Slightly. The deviation from the last tracked vector is small. It places the contact's projected path through a gap in the coordination narrated pattern." He saw where I was going before I finished. "Yes. If the coordination node transmitted the coverage pattern in its acknowledgement response." "Standard protocol," he said. "Standard protocol." We both sat with that for a moment. The coordination node had acknowledged Veth's transmission with a standard response package, as every coordination node does. A compressed bundle of operational data that includes, among other things, the node's current coverage pattern, its active monitoring sectors, and the positions of communion hulls within its coordination radius. This information is transmitted, as a matter of course, because the doctrine assumes that any communion hull receiving the acknowledgement is a communion hull that needs the information to operate correctly. It had not been designed to withhold that information from an enemy that was within passive listening range. The contact had been within passive listening range when Veth transmitted. It knew where the coverage gap was, I said. Before it adjusted its vector, Veth said. We did not say anything else about it. There was nothing useful to say. Veth was already composing an addendum to his next broadcast. I watched him write it. He included the hour 9 ghost edge contact, vector deviation, the calculated passive listening range implication, and a recommendation that the Communion's coordination node acknowledgement protocols be reviewed for information security exposure. He included it in plain language, without qualification, the way a man with 40 years of self-reference Fright things he has already decided he will not soften. 23 of the 900 hulls were confirmed active when the Veth completed its sensor sweep of the engagement sector on the outbound run. 23. I wrote that number into the monitoring log myself, because Veth-Shoal asked me to. And I have never forgotten the physical sensation of writing it. The slight resistance in the bioluminescent tation medium as the number took permanent form. 23. Not 203. Not 230. 23. Out of 900. In a 47-minute engagement against a contact that had never deviated from its original vector by more than the minimum necessary to remain inside our formation. The contact had not been stopped. It had passed through the shoal clusters, continued on its vector, and was now somewhere in the space between the Veth-Shoal and the ocean passage. We transmitted the communion-wide emergency alert again on the outbound run. Then again, Avar's voice on the transmission was the same steady amber volume voice he had used throughout. Calm, precise, information-dense. He gave the contact's last known vector, its last known speed, its mass estimate, its hull configuration inferences, its weapon output characteristics as I had logged them, its surface treatment profile as Veth-Shoal had identified it. Then he said the thing that I think about more than anything else when I think about that transmission. This contact has no archive entry in any communion classification system. It has no emission tail, no registration signature, no origin data. The surface treatment profile indicates deliberate design for non-detection. The hull has been engineered to move through space without being found. This engagement record is the first logged encounter. The communion should proceed from the assumption that this contact is not singular, that there may be others of this configuration in spaces we have not yet looked, on vectors we have not yet projected, at distances from communion territory we have not yet considered. The defining characteristic of this hull class is that you do not know where it is until it chooses to act. Proceed accordingly. He closed the transmission and turned off the broadcast array. The Anth. I sat at my monitoring station for a long time after the transmission ended. The readout was quiet. Veth-Shoal debris drifted on its predictable vectors around us. The hull was warm under my palms. Veth-Shoal was at her station, running a passive sweep. I knew she was running not because she expected to find anything, but because staying at her station and running protocols was the way a navigator with 60 years of service copes with the 47 minutes she had just watched. I thought about the surface treatment. I thought about a shipyard somewhere in human space, a place I had never seen, in a territory my navigation archive described in terms of transit distances and political classifications and emissions band profiles. I thought about the people in that shipyard and the choice they had made at the manufacturing stage, the choice to build a hull that would be absent from the space it occupied, the choice to spend whatever resources that required, the design work, the material cost, the operational discipline of suppressing every active emission across the full mass of a hull of that size for the entire transit station. All of it, all of that, in service of a single objective. To be where they were without the archive knowing they were there. I thought about Avar's question, is this the only one? And I thought about the thing he had not said, which was that the question could not be answered by looking at the space we had already looked at, because the nature of the hull class was that you found it in the space you were already looking at, only when it was ready to be found. You could not find the others by looking harder. You could only find them when they acted. And the one we had found had acted in a place and time of its own choosing, against a force of 900 hulls, and had proceeded on its vector after the engagement, exactly as it had before, and was now somewhere between the Veth-Shoal and the ocean passage, and we did not know if it would stop there, or if there was somewhere beyond there that was also on its vector, that was also on NOAA Archive's list of things that required protection, because nothing had ever been there before. I am older now than I was on the Veth. The scar memories in my outer membrane are starting to accumulate. I can see 4 of them when I look at my reflection in a still growth bath, which is fewer than Veth-Shoal had, and more than I expected to have at this stage of my service. I have been in 3 engagements since the Veth-Shoal. I have logged contacts that turned out to be refraction ghosts and contacts that turned out to be exactly what they looked like, and 2 contacts that turned out to be things I was not fully prepared for. None of them were what the Grev-Anth found in the Veth-Shoal corridor on the 4th hour of the 3rd patrol cycle of my first mission. The Communion's official record of the engagement describes the contact as a human null-class warship, a designation the classification office created after the fact, based entirely on the monitoring record I produced from the track Grev-Anth scanner lobe because there was no prior file to draw from. Null class. The word does not mean 0 or nothing in the administrative register. It means unclassified, origin unknown, archive absent. It means the Communion named it for the quality it had when we found it. The quality of not being in any file that told us what it was. I do not think that name is correct. I have thought about better names over the years, and I have not found one that is fully accurate, which I think is itself part of the truth. What I know is that the hull had been designed by people who understood something important about the nature of a threat, not the nature of firepower, or drive capability, or hull armor. All of those were present in abundance, and the shoal crusaders found out about them in the worst possible way. But those are qualities that any sufficiently resourced shipyard can produce in sufficient degree. What the hull had been designed to understand was something different and, I think, more fundamental. It had been designed to be somewhere without being found there first. And the Communion, in 300 years of logged contact with human territory, had never once considered that a hull might be somewhere in its space before the archive said the hull existed. The archive had a process for logging contacts. Process required a contact to be made before a file could be opened. The hull had been built to ensure the contact was made on its terms, in a place and time of its choosing, against a force assembled according to protocols that assumed the enemy would behave the way previous enemies had behaved. The Communion had a file for everything it had ever encountered. It had no file for a hull that moved through its space before the file was opened. It had no protocol for an engagement that had already begun, before the encounter was authorized. It had no doctrine for a force that existed in the space between the archive's last update and the moment the weapons activated. The archive was the problem. The archive assumed that the space it had not yet looked at was empty, because nothing had given it reason to look there. The hull had been built by people who knew the archive made that assumption, and who had decided, at the manufacturing stage, built into the outer layer of a hull that cost resources I cannot estimate, to use that assumption as a weapon. They used it well. I am a drift senior now. I have newly bloomed navigators at my station the way Veth-Shoal had me at hers. And I watch them the way she watched me, with the particular attention an old navigator pays to young eyes, looking to see if they have the instinct for the extra filter pass, the willingness to report a contact that might turn out to be a refraction ghost and earn them a reputation for false positives. I tell them, when I train them, that the extra filter pass is never wrong, that the refraction ghost it finds is worth the time to rule out, that the contact it finds, when it is real, is not something you can afford to miss. I tell them what the Veth-Shoal taught me about the nature of an archive. An archive is a record of what has been seen. It has no entry for what has not been seen. And the absence of an entry does not mean the absence of a thing. The Communion's archive was the most comprehensive collection of observational data in its region of space. It had entries for every hull class that had ever been detected, every alien configuration that had ever been scanned, every weapon profile that had ever been logged. The navigators who maintained it were thorough. The protocols that generated it were sound. The archive had no entry for a hull that did not want to be in the archive. I tell my newly bloomed navigators this in the first session after their spore bloom. I tell them before they have touched a scanner lobe, before they have run their first filter protocol, before the Grev-Anth story, or any story like it, is a real thing to them rather than a training document. I tell them because it is the foundational instruction, and everything else the Communion can teach them about passive monitoring and rejection protocols and debris field contact management rests on it. The archive tells you what has been found. The extra filter pass is how you find what the archive has no entry for. Shh. I tell them what Veth-Shoal told me, because it is still the truest thing I know about the void. That we have no archive entry, for it does not mean it is not there. Veth-Shoal retired from active patrol service in the second year after the Veth-Shoal engagement. He did not seek ceremony. He transmitted a short message to the breeding ground and went quiet. I heard later that he had chosen a small outer margin station far from any patrol corridor. A place where the debris was old and predictable, and nothing moved through the scatter bands that had not been logged for 100 years. I understood that choice. I do not judge it. Veth-Shoal served another 8 years. She died in open space, the way she had always said she expected to die, on a monitoring station, running passive scans of a debris field on an outer margin patrol, not in an engagement, not in a crisis. In the ordinary persistent work of watching a piece of space that needed watching, the same work she had done for the better part of a lifetime. Her monitoring log was complete to within 3 minutes of her death. She had made no entry in those last 3 minutes, which I think means she died between scans, between the moment one filter pass completed and the moment she would have begun the next, in the small quiet interval that exists in every monitoring cycle where the readout is still and the void offers nothing new. It is a good way to go for a navigator. The log is clean. The watch was kept. I kept the passive monitoring record from Grevanth. Scanner lobe. I have the raw data file. I have never submitted it to the Communion's central archive for integration, which I know is a procedural violation, and which I have never corrected. Tell myself I have not corrected it, because the archive already has the official record, and the raw data offers nothing the official record does. Not contain. This is not entirely true. The raw data contains something the official record does not. At the 47th minute of the engagement, 12 minutes after Shoal Commander Veth-Shoal's hull went cold, my scanner lobe captured a 2-second passive return from the contact's hull surface, at a scan angle that the monitoring protocols do not specifically require. I ran the protocol that covered the adjacent angle. The adjacent angle captured the return, 2 seconds. The official record was compiled from the monitoring protocols as written, rather than from every scan my lobe ran, does not contain this return. I have looked at it many times. What the return shows is this. The contact's hull surface, in the 2 seconds my scanner captured it, was undamaged. Not minimally damaged. Not showing the minor scoring that even the heaviest engagement leaves on a hull's outer plating. Undamaged in a way that was as inconsistent with 47 minutes inside a formation of 900 active Communion combat hulls. Defensive secretions alone should have produced surface etching visible in a passive scan at my range. There was nothing on the hull. The hull that moved through 900 living ships and left 23 of them active when it was done had taken nothing from the exchange that my equipment could detect. It had emerged from the Veth-Shoal engagement exactly as it had entered the Veth-Shoal, cold, quiet, moving on its vector, emitting nothing that told the space around it that it existed, carrying in its outer plating no record that the 900 hulls had ever happened to it. I have thought about what that means for a long time. A warship that leaves no trace of its battles on its hull is not bragging. It is not displaying a clean surface for the benefit of anyone watching. It simply does not carry the engagements with it. It moves into the space after the engagement the same way it moved into the space before, because the engagement was a feature of a transit, not a crisis to recover from. A thing encountered and passed through, the way a current passes through debris, the way a thought passes through a quiet mind. It was going somewhere. The 900 hulls were between it and where it was going. It passed through them and continued. I do not know where it was going. I know the vector. The vector pointed at the ocean passage and beyond. Beyond the ocean passage, on that vector extended to its logical end, is the outer margin of the Communion's third breeding ground. And past that, the inner communication network that connects the Communion's 7 largest population centers. I do not know if the hull reached any of those places. I do not know if it was intercepted. I do not know if there were other hulls on other vectors. The null class, unregistered, absent from the archive. moving cold through spaces no one had thought to monitor with the particular patience that the extra filter pass requires. I transmitted everything I had, and then the Grev, Anth, ran, and the Thresh Veil closed behind us, and the void gave me nothing else. I still run the extra filter pass on every scan cycle. I run it because Vorath Keln told me to, and because the 7 scar memories in her outer membrane told me she had earned the right to give that instruction. I run it because the refraction ghost it finds 9 times in 10 is worth the 1 time in 10 when the return is real. I run it because the contact that survives all 3 rejection protocols and has no archive entry and moves through the debris with a surface treatment that absorbs rather than reflects, and a mass emission ratio that violates the parameters of everything you have been grown to expect. That contact, when you find it, is worth finding. And because I have believed since the 4th hour of the 3rd patrol cycle of my first mission, and nothing I have learned since has changed this belief. That the hull I found was not the only one, that somewhere in the spaces the archive has not yet looked, in the debris corridors where the scatter is high and the refraction ghosts are plentiful, and a newly bloomed navigator on their first patrol might be forgiven for assuming the extra filter pass is unnecessary. There are other hulls on other vectors. Cold, quiet, moving, designed from the manufacturing stage to be absent from the space they occupy, waiting for no one's permission to arrive.